Good afternoon and welcome to this Stadio School of Education online distance learning event. Our next session in today's program is ACL 101, and this is for the July intake of the Diploma in Grade R Teaching and the Bachelor of Education in Foundation phase with your lecturer, Ms. Dana Sita. Good afternoon, Ms. Sita.
Hi, Simon. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. And yourself?
I'm well, thanks. All right, so thank you to the students who are attending. I just want to remind you that, as usual, if you have any questions that come up while I'm speaking, please put those into the Q&A box or the chat box, and then I will make sure to address those questions. So if anything is unclear or you have questions that you wanted to be addressed in the session, please do use that Q&A box. I want to try and have a bit more of a Q&A type style lecture today, because I have received emails that a couple of students wanted to ask specific questions, so please do take the opportunity to do so. So the first thing I wanted to do is just take you back to that schedule we have for the semester. So you should see that on your screen now. So we are now at the end of this week of the 28th September. So by now you should have finished going through the material for Unit 4. And in fact, us getting to the end of this week means that we are finished with the theory of this module. So that means that from next week, you're going to be really just working on these two big assessments that they are for ACL 101. So the first big assessment is that final essay, which is worth 35% of your mark. And so the whole of next week and the week after that, you're going to have the time to really look at the feedback that we'll release on Monday, make sure that you understand it, and then change your essay, fix up your essay so that you can get the best mark possible for that final essay. So remember, for the final essay, what you're going to do is have a look at that feedback you receive on your draft essay, and then change your essay. And the amount of changes you make is going to depend on your mark, and it's going to depend on the feedback you received. So if you're quite happy with your mark and you're happy with your feedback, then just make, the minor edits and changes, and then you can hand it in as is. But if you're not happy, if you realize that you've made quite a lot of mistakes, then you're probably going to have to change that essay quite a bit. So you can change it as little or as much as you want, but the big thing to remember is that you can't change topics. So you can change your position on the topic, but you must stick to the same topic that you wrote your draft essay on. So that is going to be our next 2 weeks. And as I said, that feedback is going to be released on Monday. Then after that, we're going to have 2 weeks to really focus on test 3. So I know that some students are feeling a little bit anxious about test 3. What we're going to do in those weeks should prepare you adequately for test 3. So you will have past papers to work through when we're doing this test 3 preparation week, and a practice test. Remember, we're also going to be releasing the name of the article that the test will be based on. So by the time you get to test 3, you will know exactly what the article is. You will have had time to read it carefully, to make your notes on the article, to really understand the article that test 3 is based on. And you will have had the opportunity to do past papers and practice tests, so you know how the test will look. So I know that Unit 4 is a bit tricky and it can be a bit daunting, but remember that you still have time to really prepare for that test. And of course, you still have time now to fix up your final essay. The other thing that I want to remind you about is that you can book callbacks with me. So let me just share my screen once again, and then I can show that to you. So here is our ACL 101 page. So when you're confused about something, so for instance, if you're confused about anything in Unit 4, the first thing you're going to do is add your query to the questionnaire. I look at these questionnaires, and if queries come up in them, then I can make a FAQ page where I answer those questions. But unfortunately, most students haven't been filling in these questionnaires, so I haven't been able to make a FAQ page for Unit 6 or Unit 5 because there just weren't any questions. So if you want me to answer those questions and make those FAQ pages, you need to go to the effort of filling in the questionnaire. The other thing you can do is right at the bottom of the page, there's an appointment scheduler. You can book an appointment. And those are 15-minute appointments where we can talk personally via Zoom or via phone if you can't make a Zoom appointment. And you can ask me your specific questions. So those are the other things just to remember to utilize during these kind of assessment preparation weeks. Okay, so I see there's some questions. Let me have a look. So someone is asking when you'll get your test 2 marks. So those will probably also come out early next week. We just have to wait for the retests to be completed, and they finish today, because when we open up that test 2 for you to look at your marks, you'll also be able to look at the model answers. So we want you to have a fair assessment, so we didn't want to release that when people still hadn't written the retest. The next question is, what does test 3 consist of and how many attempts are you allowed? So remember, with all your assessments, there is a full explanation of what they consist of in the assessment guide, and there is that assessment video that explains. But basically, just in summary, test 3 is going to cover all the units of this module, but with a particular focus on Unit 4, and it's going to be based on one of the articles that we've covered in Unit 4. And next week I will release the details about which article it is so that you can prepare it in advance. Okay, then there's a question that says, for that activity under lesson 5, which was analyzing the different essays, there was a comment that I made that said clumsy about one of the sentences in one of those example essays. And so the student wants to know, what does this sort of comment mean? So basically, if something in your essay is highlighted as clumsy or as having a grammatical error, it basically just means you need to reformulate the sentence. The sentence doesn't really make sense, or the way that you've worded the sentence is not perfectly grammatically correct. So if you see that sort of thing, it means that you just need to reformulate that sentence. Okay, but getting back to the essays then, it's a good time to jump into the content that I wanted to cover in this lecture. So I know that you don't yet have your feedback, and that will be released to you on Monday. But I still want to go through the common errors that came up when we marked those draft essays, because a lot of students are making quite similar errors. And as I go through this, think back to your draft essay and think about whether you've made this sort of error so that you know how to correct it when you work on your final essay and when you're going through the feedback on your draft essay on Monday. Okay, so let me just open the PowerPoint. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk to you about is academic tone. So this is the first aspect of the rubric, which talks about your style and language. Part of that aspect of the rubric is really all about whether or not you're able to maintain an academic tone. And if you're not sure what an academic tone entails, then you need to go back to Unit 1 and reflect on Unit 1 and redo it maybe, because Unit 1 was where we really covered what makes a piece of writing academic and how to maintain an academic tone. But for now, there are a few pointers that I want to give you because there were a few errors that came up in very many students' work. So the first thing is the use of personal pronouns. So when you're writing academically, you're supposed to use the third person, which means that you shouldn't be using personal pronouns such as I, we, me, us. So you shouldn't be saying things like we should or I feel, I think, because this is a more informal way of writing and it's a more personal way of writing. And when you write academically, you want to come across as objective. So you want to kind of take the personal out of it, and one way to do it is to take the personal pronouns out of your essay. So let's look at an example. So this would be a typical sentence in orange that is coming up in the draft essays, where people will say, we should convert public schools to mixed-sex schools in South Africa. And this would be incorrect. You would need to reformulate the sentence to take out the personal pronoun. And one way to do that is to say, all public schools in South Africa should be mixed-sex. In orange, here's another example of the improper use of personal pronouns. So I think that school uniforms should be mandatory. Wherever you see that you've used words like I think, I feel, I believe, you can pretty much just cross that out. So if we cross that out, the I think that, then the rest of the sentence is fine. So then your sentence just becomes school uniforms should be mandatory. So we've just crossed out the I think part of it. And this makes it more convincing and it sounds more objective. The second thing is that you should not use the second person when writing academically. So that means you can't use you. So you shouldn't write sentences like what you see in orange here, which is when schools implement a zero tolerance policy, you can be expelled for relatively minor offenses. You shouldn't address the reader directly. Rather, talk about who you want to talk about. So in this case, what you really want to say is that learners can be expelled for relatively minor offenses. So just replace the you with the more accurate word. So when you go through your essay before you hand it in as the final essay, make sure that you take out all these instances of first person pronouns and second person pronouns. There are also a couple of other things that came up with academic tone in many essays. The first thing is rhetorical questions. So a lot of students used rhetorical questions such as, should school uniforms be mandatory? So in an argumentative essay, you shouldn't be asking your audience questions because you're the person who's meant to be providing the answer to the question along with evidence to back up your point of view. So you should make sure that you get rid of any rhetorical questions and ask yourself, what was I trying to convey with this rhetorical question? What was I trying to imply? And then just say that straight out instead of turning it into a question. You also need to make sure that you don't use contractions. So don't use don't, couldn't, can't, it's, shouldn't, to name a few examples. Whenever you see that you've used a contraction, turn it into the full word. So don't must become do not. Couldn't must become could not. Can't, cannot. It's, it is. And shouldn't, should not. The reason for this is because contractions are a hallmark of informal writing. And this is a formal essay, so you need to make sure that you don't use them. Next, you need to make sure that you don't use emotive or extreme language. So you shouldn't say things like, I'm very against this topic, or I absolutely agree, because this is quite an emotive way to state your position. And it takes away from that objective tone we're trying to create. You should also not use extreme words like it is terrible or wonderful or amazing or appalling. Tone down your language and try to sound more moderate, because if you talk in a moderate way, it helps you to seem objective. Finally, don't use slang. So in a lot of essays, people refer to children as kids, and this is a slang word. When in the essay about school uniform policies, a lot of people talk about civvies. Again, this is a slang word. So make sure that you're not using slang words, rather change those words to the formal version of the word. So kids would become children or learners, civvies becomes civilian clothing. You wouldn't say mom or dad, you would say the mother or father, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to quickly look at some questions before we move on. Okay, so the question here is, can you use the word one instead of he, she, you? So, for example, one should respect the policy. So the answer to that question is that you can use one, because using one is a part of writing in the third person. So it's acceptable to use one, he, she, they, because those are all pronouns that belong to the third person. The only pronouns you're going to avoid are I, my, you, your, and we, us, because those are personal pronouns or pronouns that belong to the second person. Okay, so let's move on then. Oh, my slideshow doesn't want to change. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about structure. So I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time going through this information about structure, and that is because you already have videos that really go into detail about how to structure your essay. But what I want to bring to your attention is that it is absolutely imperative that you structure your essay in the way that is explained in Lesson 5 in your study guide and in the videos for Unit 5 or Lesson 5. If you structure your essay in this way, it is much easier for you to get a higher mark, because firstly, there are marks allocated for structure in this essay, and secondly, when you structure your essay like this, it helps force you to convey the content in the way that is convincing and in a way that is well backed up. So by having a good structure, you improve your mark for structure and your mark for content. So this is not something optional. This isn't something where you can kind of take the advice or leave it. You need to follow the guidelines that have been laid out in Lesson 5 and make sure that you structure your essay according to those guidelines. So here you see is a little screenshot from your ECI page. The other thing that is absolutely imperative is that you go and look at the videos for Lesson 5. There's a video on how to structure your introduction and conclusion. There's a video on how to structure your paragraphs. And you need to use these videos to make sure that you structure your essay in the correct way. So please, in terms of structure, make sure that after this lecture and sometime during next week and the week after that are devoted to the essay, you go and watch these videos or re-watch them if you've already watched them, and make sure you really understand how to structure this essay, and then go through your essay along with the videos and make sure that you're ticking all the boxes. So I would recommend that when you're fixing up your draft essay, you put the video about introductions on, and you sit with your introduction and you pause the video as it goes through each component and make sure that your introduction has fulfilled that component, or if it hasn't, then you correct it, then you press play on the video and move on to the next component, and so on. And you can do this with your conclusion and with your paragraphs. So really use these videos as a recipe for your essay, because that is what they're intended to be. Okay. Gosh, PowerPoint keeps freezing. There we go. All right, so now let's move on to some tips about your content. So the biggest problem that I found in your draft essays is that a lot of you don't support your claims with research. So often there'll be no in-text references or allusions to evidence or research in a paragraph. And that means that I have to assume that either the information in that paragraph is inaccurate or it's just your opinion. And that is not the task of an academic essay. An academic essay is not an opinion piece. It is a research essay. So every paragraph should refer to research and evidence to back up the claims that you make in the paragraph. So you should see at least one in-text reference in every paragraph, because that shows that you've referred to evidence in that paragraph. So you need to back up every single claim you make with evidence. But that evidence needs to be credible evidence. So you need to make sure that you use credible sources. So it's better to use academic sources. And these would be your academic books, textbooks, journal articles, as these are peer-reviewed sources that are credible. It's not such a good idea to rely too heavily on things like blogs. This is because blogs are really just one person's opinion. And so someone could post something on a blog and it could be completely untrue. And you wouldn't know because blogs aren't fact-checked. In the same way, if you're writing an essay about uniforms, for instance, you shouldn't rely heavily on the sales website for a uniform company, because they have a vested interest in uniforms, so the information they provide to you might be biased. Essentially, you need to make sure that the evidence you're relying on is credible, it's fact-checked, and it's not biased. So rather rely on things like academic sources, because you know that they've been peer-reviewed and someone's already gone and checked that they're not biased and they're not inaccurate. So you don't have to do the checking yourself. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use websites and other sources. It just means that when you use a website or another source, you have to be the fact checker. So you have to make sure that you check it and make sure there isn't obvious bias. You should probably go and check if a couple of websites say the same thing, or if this is the only anomaly that's making a particular point. You should look at when the website was last updated, who the author was, etc., and make sure that this is a credible site. And one way of doing this is by using the CRAAP test, which we went through in Unit 4. So go through Unit 4 and use that CRAAP test to make sure that your sources are credible. The next thing to do is to make sure that you don't try and back up your claims with generalizations or stereotypes, because this isn't proper evidence. Generalizations and stereotypes are actually often quite harmful and not at all useful in a research essay. So, for instance, it's probably not a good idea to say that schools shouldn't be single sex because boys are naughtier than girls, because there's no evidence for that statement. That is just a generalization. If you wanted to make that sort of statement, you would need to go find research that backs up that claim. And if you can't find research to back up that claim, it's probably a stereotype that isn't true. So you need to make sure that you don't rely on these kind of harmful stereotypes or even kind of mundane, benign generalizations, because these aren't factual. And you will lose marks if you rely on generalizations instead of actual facts and evidence. Lastly, you need to make sure that you don't try and back up your claims with personal experience or personal conversations. So you can't use something from your life to try back up your claims in a paragraph. So, for instance, if you're already working as a teacher and you found that learners behave better when they wear uniforms, that can't be evidence in this essay. This is not a personal reflective essay. This is a research essay. So the only evidence that you can use to back up your claims is evidence that is from academic research sources. So it can't be personal experience. In the same way, you can't go and interview your friends or your parents or other colleagues and ask them to comment on the essay and then refer to that as evidence in this project. When you get to honors and masters, you might conduct a study which involves qualitative data as an interview format type of thing, and that's fine. But this is not the project here. The project here is for you to base this essay on research that already exists. So make sure not to rely on any personal conversations or experience. Okay, I'm going to quickly look at the Q&A chat here. Okay, one question here is, are abstracts credible? So abstracts, you'll remember from Unit 4, are the beginning part of a journal article that really is just a summary of that journal article. And I would say that you should avoid referring to an abstract, because an abstract is essentially like the back of a book. So at the back of a book, before you buy it from the shop, it has a little summary of what the book is about, and you use that to decide whether or not you're going to buy the book. Abstracts are the same thing for journal articles. And in the same way that that summary at the back of a book is really quite vague and general, the abstract is usually quite general, and you need to be reading and referring to the specifics of an article. So rather read the entire article and refer to the relevant section of the article, not the abstract. The next question is, if your referencing was not correct in the draft essay, would the marker just point it out, or did they correct the referencing? So the short answer here is that if we had corrected each and every instance of incorrect referencing, then we would be marking this until next year. So we can't correct every instance of improper referencing. So the marker may have corrected the first mistake, or they might have just pointed out that there's a mistake that you need to go and fix. And the reason for this is because you already do have the tools to fix your referencing mistakes. So if you're making referencing mistakes, it just means you need to go look at those videos from Unit 2 and use them to fix your mistakes. And if you're still not sure, if you've watched all those videos, if you have gone through the referencing guide and you're really still unsure, then you're going to send me an email and ask me, or you're going to book an appointment using the scheduler at the bottom of the ECI page, and then we'll have an appointment to discuss how to fix those references. I see the next question was a similar question about referencing, so I hope that answers both of your questions. Okay, let's move on. Let's just wait for my PowerPoint to come back to us. The next important thing to remember with content is that this is an argumentative essay. And when you write an argumentative essay, you have to take a position. It's a bit like a debate. So if you debated in school or have ever kind of watched a debate, maybe a presidential debate, such as the very poor debate the US had on Monday, or if you've even, debated an issue with a friend, you'll know that part of that is taking a position. So when you're arguing about a topic, you don't kind of sit in the fence. You don't say, oh, I don't know. You don't contradict yourself and sometimes agree with the topic and then sometimes disagree. That's not a good way to argue. You need to take a position and stick to it. So you shouldn't have sentences like this in your essay. This essay will explore the advantages and disadvantages of zero tolerance policies. And the problem here is that you're saying the essay is going to look at the good parts and the bad parts, the advantages and the disadvantages. And that is not the task here. You have to choose whether you're going to focus on the advantages or the disadvantages, and then that has to be the focus of your essay. So you need to make your position clear from the very beginning of your essay, from the introduction, and then stick to your position all the way through the essay. So absolutely do not try and look at both sides of the argument and then only decide which one you agree with in the conclusion. From the very beginning, your position must be clear, and in each paragraph, you're going to be really focusing on one of the reasons why your position is valid and trying to back up your position in that way. If you decide that it's going to be helpful for you to refer to counter arguments, that's fine, but you must immediately refute them, which means that you must immediately say why that counter argument is wrong. So for instance, here's an example. So the first sentence is a counter argument. If we imagine that I was writing an essay which was arguing that school uniforms should be done away with. So here is the counter argument that goes against my position. And then in the very next sentence, I show why that counter argument is wrong. So that's what you must do if you refer to counter arguments. Now, obviously, this is not a full paragraph. This is very short. The reason there's a ... here is because you would have to then explain further why that counter argument is wrong and have a concluding sentence of the paragraph and so on. But essentially, this just shows you that whenever you mention the other side or something that isn't your position, you need to immediately show why that doesn't mean that your position isn't valid anymore and show that your position is still the better position straight away. All right, let me have a look at questions here. Okay, so I see that there's a request here that the text in the slideshow be in a different font or a bigger font to be clearer. I apologize if it's not clear. I will put these slides on ECI, so then if you didn't see anything during this presentation, you can go back and have a look. Okay, and as usual, I think every time I look at the questions, the slideshow freezes. Okay, so let's move on to referencing. So again, the same kind of errors came up with referencing in quite a few students' essays. And there were a lot of errors with the in-text referencing. So I want to clarify the in-text referencing now. And remember, in-text referencing is the same throughout your essay. You don't reference differently in text depending on the source. That's what you do in the reference list. So you should be able to make sure that your in-text references are accurate. So there's just two caveats here. Make sure that your in-text references are inserted directly after the information that you have paraphrased or quoted, not at the end of the paragraph. So if you had two sentences talking about information you got from the source, then at the end of the second sentence, you will have your in-text reference. And then the other thing to remember is that your in-text reference must go before the full stop, not after it. Also, make sure that you in-text reference whenever you refer to information that you found in another source. So you're not only going to in-text reference when you quote, you're going to in-text reference when you paraphrase and when you quote, and basically every time you refer to information that you didn't make up. So actually we want to see a lot of in-text references, because if there are a lot of in-text references, that means that the information in your essay is based on sources and research and not just your opinion, which is exactly what we want from this essay. Now, as you will hopefully remember, there are two types of formats for an in-text reference. If your in-text reference is at the end of the sentence, then the format, in blue is the format of the in-text reference. So you're going to provide the author's surname, the year of publication, a colon, and page numbers, if the source has page numbers. If it's a website without page numbers, then you will leave out the colon and leave out the page numbers. Important to note here is that there's no comma between the surname and year. A lot of students inserted that comma, and that makes the in-text reference wrong. You're also going to just write page number. You're not going to write the word page or P for page. You're just going to put the number in. The other type of format for an in-text reference is for when the author's surname is part of the sentence. So if you write something like, according to Smith, then you're going to keep that surname outside of the brackets because it's part of the sentence. Then the only thing in brackets is your year and your page numbers, if there are page numbers. So a lot of students would say things like according to, but then the surname would still be inside of the brackets. And then that sentence stops making grammatical sense. So remember, if the surname is part of the sentence, it has to stay outside of the brackets. So here is an example of a paragraph with in-text references. So here are two examples where the author's surname is part of the sentence. So here, the sentence is Block claims that, and then there's a quote. Now, because the surname is part of the sentence, it stays outside of the brackets. Then inside of the brackets, we have the year of publication. And there's no colon or page numbers because obviously this is a source which doesn't have page numbers. The next example is de Villiers and Steyn comment that lecturers might be tempted to adopt the curriculum. Again, the surnames are part of the sentence, so we don't put them into the brackets. They stay outside of the brackets. And then inside of the brackets is the year of publication and the page where we found that information. In green, you see examples of references at the end of the sentence. So here, the author's surnames are not part of the sentence. So then at the end of the sentence, the author's surname can be within the brackets, and that sort of reference goes just before the full stop. As you can see, the page numbers here are different for each reference to de Villiers and Steyn. And that's because all of this information came from different pages of the source. So when you refer to the page in text, you're referring to the exact page where you found the information. So something to remember here is to make sure basically that if the surname is part of the sentence, it stays outside of the brackets. But if the surname is not part of the sentence, the whole reference should be at the end of the sentence before the full stop, and the surname can be within the brackets. Another important thing to remember is that you can only include something in your reference list if you've referred to it in text. So this is an example of the reference list for that essay. And as you can see, here's the full reference for de Villiers and Steyn, and there's the full reference for Block. The reason we can have these references as part of the reference list is because these sources were referred to in text. And so we can assume about this essay that Hoppers and Matala were referred to in a separate paragraph. The big thing to remember here is that you can't have something be part of your reference list if it doesn't appear as an in-text reference in the paragraphs of your essay. And this was quite a common error. Often you would have a whole lot of sources in your reference list, but no in-text references, or only 1 or 2 in-text references. And if you do that, then you're stuck in that 11 to 15 category of the rubric for referencing. So you lose quite a lot of marks if there's inconsistency between your reference list and your references. Some other points to remember about the reference list is that it must be in alphabetical order. You should not use bullet points or numbers in your reference list. And you need to make sure that you meet the minimum source requirements. So as I previously said, it's a good idea to make sure that you try and rely on academic sources. But regardless, you need to refer to at least 1 academic book and 1 academic journal. It's a good idea to try to refer to more, but that is the absolute minimum requirement. You also need to have at least 4 sources for this essay. Again, you can have more, and that would be a good idea, but that is the absolute minimum. All right, so that is all I had to say about the common errors that came up. Let me have a look at questions. Okay, so I see the student who requested that a bigger text font be used was referring to the tests. So unfortunately, that font and the size is determined by the ECI platform, because it's an online test. So if it looks small to you, the best option is to zoom in on your computer. So on your browser, you should have an option to increase the size, and that will help you to see the questions more clearly. But again, if this is something that you're struggling with, pop me an email and I can help you with that. And I will obviously make sure that, and I do make sure that everything is legible in those tests, because otherwise it would be unfair. So I have made sure that it is all legible. It probably is the case that you need to zoom in on your browser. And the last question is that if you wrote about the advantages and the disadvantages in your essay, does that mean you automatically fail? So it isn't going to cause you to automatically fail, but you will lose quite a few marks for content. So if you did well in all the other sections of the rubric, then you might not fail. But you know, if you add this issue to other issues with your essay, it could lead to you failing. But it's not on its own going to cause you to fail, but it's going to cause you to lose a lot of marks for content, and that's quite a big part of the rubric. So it's a good idea to try and avoid making this mistake. All right, so that is, oh, I see one more question. It says, how do we find books to use? So I know that it is difficult to go to libraries because of coronavirus. So if you want to use a book source, the best thing to do is to go onto EBSCOhost. They have a whole variety of ebooks, and I have gone and checked all these topics, and there are ebooks on EBSCOhost available for these topics. So go and look at the ebook collection. If you go back to Unit 6, there's a video explaining how to look at the ebooks on EBSCOhost. So make sure you do that to find a book. However, I know that things are difficult because of the coronavirus pandemic, so I'm not going to be too strict about this requirement. If you can't find a book, you must use 2 journals at least. So the minimum requirement then is that you must have at least 1 book and 1 journal source. But if you can't find a book, then you must have 2 academic journal sources. Again, try and use more academic journals and try to find the books because they are better sources, but that would then be the minimum. And that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you very much to the students who attended. I will put the video onto ECI, and I will make those slides available.
Rosita, we thank you for an informative and enjoyable session this morning, and we wish you a lovely weekend ahead.
Thank you, you too.